I'll stand here so that you guys can use the one.
Yeah, and learn this.
And he was like,
Right.
"You could have
Oh,
been
yes.
through as a surprise to the audience."
for setting up.
And like, and so my first concern, and
Let's
he
get started.
doesn't speak English.
Got a little crowd here, and a little crowd there. I know there's some other people joining, but it's my pleasure to introduce Gregory Smits, who teaches at Penn State University. He's professor of history and Asian studies. He's in the history department. And has published 4 monographs. He's going to talk about a new one today. At least one of those has been translated into Japanese. Come on in. Just getting started. Hi, Nick. And just introducing Greg Smith from Penn State. Yeah, professor of history and Asian studies. I stopped counting at 35 articles. Greg is very impressive. I just was talking to him this morning. Having not seen him in about 10 years, just the wide breadth of his interests and his abilities to use a wide variety of materials, including quite scientific ones. His topics have ranged broadly from earthquakes and volcanoes to a lot of focus on the Ryukyu Islands, which we'll be talking about today, from a variety of perspectives, including thought and politics and Confucianism, I think in that first book particularly. He and I got to know each other from a conference that resulted in a volume in 2015 called Japan, Environment and Society, from Prehistory to the Present. And I use that book frequently, but very particularly Greg's article, which is on Japanese attempts in the Edo period to come to terms with the meaning, causes and meanings of earthquakes. And he really lays out an interesting argument that moves from a kind of cultural moral set of understandings to later include a kind of proto-scientific understandings in yin-yang theory. And it really works with the students, so I've appreciated that article a great deal. He has another whole book on earthquakes in Japan, particularly the Ansei earthquake in the Edo period and its long legacies. So I consider him an environmental historian. This morning he was saying that might not be his first identity in terms of how he describes himself, but I think you get a sense of the kinds of topics he's interested in. Most recent monograph he was telling me has to do partly with soil. So I'm interested in learning more about that. But to remind everyone, this talk is part of the series on maritime Asia, East Asia, that Morton has organized. And just for Greg to know, since Morton joined as the director of the East Asia Studies Center, or took on that role, he's reimagined these colloquiums to do them more thematically, which has been quite helpful. So we were the second, I think, or the third in a series this semester on maritime East Asia. So with that, I hope you'll join me in welcoming Greg. And one other last personal point, I don't think he'll mind me saying that I just learned he lived as a young boy here for 3 years in Bloomington. His father was a professor at IU. So he'll be spending a few days afterwards kind of reliving his salad days, I guess. Yes. So Greg, welcome again to Bloomington.
Thank you so much for that.
And then Morton, did you have something to say or no?
We wanted you to do the intro.
Okay.
No, I'm good. This was beautiful, Scott. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Well, yeah, we're good. Okay, several years ago. Second.
There he goes. Now he's in the corner. That's perfect.
Okay.
Perfect.
Several years ago, I had a chance to give a talk at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. And so now I'm happy to be at Indiana University.
I would love to stop there, so we can talk about that too.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. And I know that there's a lot of logistics involved in an event like this, so I just want to thank all the people who helped to make this possible. Of course, Morton Oxenbowl and Teresa Kong and Jillian and Misako Matsubara, who's not able to be here, and Azami Tanaka and Scott O'Brien, and all of you for coming to the talk and zooming into the talk. So I am going to read a prepared script because I need to keep myself disciplined. This topic, I can go for hours in all kinds of directions. And so another thing about the talk is that I will be introducing some terms that may not make sense the first time around, like the official histories. Well, you can imagine there's a set of officially sanctioned history books. And then later in the talk, when it's a little bit more relevant, I'll come around and define that and show you the official histories and so forth. So hopefully by the end of the talk, all the major terms and so forth will be familiar to you. And then of course we can have Q&A. I also wrote some recurring terms up here behind me. So, I'll often be talking about tribute trade with China. But you really should understand that trade is the important word here. China is paying other people to send tribute to them, so that they, as opposed to attacking and smuggling and so forth. And speaking of smuggling, we have wako, the so-called Japanese pirates. It's actually, they're much more complicated than that, as I'll explain a little bit. And this term is really important, Wong, and it really needs to be in Chinese because it's a Chinese term. It is always translated as king, but it really means in this case a license, an officially recognized license to engage in the tribute trade. It doesn't necessarily mean much more than that. It can. Someone who has this Wong title might also be a head of a bureaucratic state, but you could also be a pirate chieftain and have the title. And then Omoro Soshi is a collection of ancient songs that was the first volume was published in around 1531. And I will make reference to that. That's one of the most important sources for very early Ryukyuan history. It's an extremely difficult source to deal with, but so that will come up as well. All right, so let me begin now. Second,
I should have read off the title of your talk there, Greg.
Oh, well, I'm sorry.
Many countries.
Bridge to Many Countries. All right, and that you'll see why I have that title in just a minute. First, I'm going to shamelessly advertise a little bit here, but to put this in context. So let me briefly contextualize my recent and ongoing research. As you know, I'm a historian of Japan, broadly defined, and my early research combined an interest in intellectual history with the Ryukyu Islands, and that resulted in the 1999 Visions of Ryukyu, a book that deals mainly with the 18th century, which is a time when we have a very wide variety of traditional historical documents. So a historian can dig into the 18th century very easily. Visions focuses on royal ideology, and although I did not realize it at the time, the book probably also documents the earliest round of ethnogenesis in the Ryukyu Islands, albeit an ethnogenesis limited to elites. If I were to rewrite this book, the main content would remain largely unchanged. But now that I know so much more about Ryukyuan history before and after the 18th century, I would reframe it differently in the introduction and conclusion. Having worked on Ryukyu since the 1980s, I became burned out by 1999, 2000. I became burned out with the topic after my first book, and I was ready for something new. I was kind of casting around, and thanks to a fortuitous encounter with a seismologist, I discovered earthquakes. And so between roughly 2005 and 2015, I published 2 books and a bunch of articles on different aspects of the intersection of seismology and society. And during that time, little did I know, there were a number of up-and-coming, innovative, interdisciplinary scholars in Japan who were doing amazing things with early Ryukyuan history in 2007, 2008, 2009. Things were coming out. And so when I came back after a decade away, all this rich literature was waiting for me, and I became absorbed with the early Ryukyuan history and coming up with a better narrative. And by better, I mean something that accords and fits well with archaeological evidence, anthropological evidence, linguistic evidence, and as well as whatever documents we may have. So my Maritime Ryukyu 1050 to 1650 was my initial attempt to write a revisionist account of the early history of the Ryukyu Islands. And in it, I argue that Ryukyuan history began in the northern Ryukyu Islands, not in the island of Okinawa. Moreover, Okinawa's so-called 3 principalities, which circa 1314 to the 1420s, appear to have been different brand names of what was in effect a shipping corporation based at the port of Naha, not small territorial states. I'll come back to that soon. Similarly, Okinawa's so-called first Sho dynasty of kings, actually of trade kings of Guam, that this was something that was cobbled together retroactively from in the 1700s or 1700s, and not all of these kings were relatives, and so re-evaluated that whole era of history here, and so the result is the Ryukyu that appears in Maritime Ryukyu is extremely different from the Ryukyu that appears in George Kerr's 1959 classic Okinawa, The History of an Island People, a book that still has tremendous influence. To give one example, Kerr portrays the Ryukyu Islands as a pacifist paradise, and I portray it as a rough and tumble frontier region full of wako. Very different. And that's just one of many examples. So in Maritime Ryukyu, I note several topics in need of further research, and I've continued working on those topics. And the result is a recently accepted manuscript entitled Early Ryukyu in History, a New Model. And so I'm estimating, a little over a year from now, it'll actually be a book. The screen is obscuring the title, but that's that book right there. We just changed the title yesterday, so if you hear me accidentally referring to it as External Agents, that was my original title. And indeed, the reason for that is because a major argument is that I argue that we have these people coming into the Ryukyu Islands from outside at different points in time, and they are the major movers of Ryukyu in history. So it's sort of an unstable thing where you have these islands, but you get this changeover of people, and as I'll explain, in our talk. So, and finally, I am nearing completion of a general history of the region, maritime Silk Roads, spanning roughly 35,000 years, with but not too much emphasis in that way back. And if all goes well, it will appear as part of the University of Chicago Press's Silk Roads book series. And I expect to have a manuscript for review ready in 3 or 4 more months. So it's a rough timeline. Yeah. So that's the situation. Here is we're gonna I can move this up a little. Yeah.
I can drop it. I can get rid of it for you if you want.
Okay. Yeah, that might, whatever you think is best. Yeah. But anyway, here's the geography. So if you're not familiar with the region. Okay, great. Thank you. If you're not familiar with the region, the Ryukyu Islands extend in an arc between the island of Kyushu to the north. I should have the laser pointer there. Don't have one. That's okay. Island of Kyushu to the north and to within sight of the island of Taiwan in the south. So from Yonaguni, here you can actually see Taiwan. There are approximately 160 islands in the Ryukyu chain, 49 of which are inhabited. And today's Ryukyu Islands are spread across 2 Japanese prefectures, Hiroshima and Okinawa. The current population is between about 1.6 to 1.7 million, most of whom live in Okinawa, the largest island in the chain. I'll zoom up a little bit on the next slide. Hang on. There we go. A little bit more detailed view here. Here's a more detailed look. Throughout most of their history, sea lanes connected the islands with the rest of the East China Sea region. Therefore, a general sense of regional geography is helpful for the topics that we examine today. In addition to the Ryukyu Islands themselves, areas of particular importance for early Ryukyu in history are the southern coast of Korea, the Korean island of Jeju, the Japanese islands of Tsushima and Iki, so right across from Korea, Hakata, today's Fukuoka, and then the western coastal areas of Kyushu, and then just straight down the Ryukyu Islands. That is a zone of travel that is just since the Jomon era, since more than 10,000 years ago, has been frequently traveled. It is helpful also to take note of the size and location of the island of Okinawa, the largest of the Ryukyu Islands. Today, there's a strong tendency to assume that Okinawa stands for the rest of the Ryukyu Islands, and would suggest we should resist that. The view is problematic. I argue that we should distinguish between the Ryukyu Islands and then Okinawa, which is just one of the Ryukyu Islands. Because the northern Ryukyu Islands today are part of Kagoshima Prefecture, they all, for that reason also, they tend to be, ignored in stories of Ryukyu and history, culture, or whatever it may be. And yet they are where all the action is in the early days. So the periodization, and I know there's a lot here, but it's really just this Gusuku era that we're going to be looking at today. The periodization scheme shown here includes some conventional time periods and also some that I have modified. Today's talk focuses on the Gusuku era, and the word Gusuku basically means fortress. There's at least 20 different hypotheses, but this era is characterized, among other things, by large-scale migrations into the Ryukyu Islands by people from Japan and, to a lesser extent, Korea, coastal Korea. It was during the 11th century that the Ryukyu Islands became Japonic in terms of population, language, and many other aspects of culture. My newest book, Early Ryukyu in History, the forthcoming one, begins with the earliest human remains found in the islands, and for that matter, all of the Japanese islands, which are these two leg bone fragments. It's actually a replica of them, which are, this one says 32,000 years old on the information, but some scholars have put it at 36,000. Who cares? A few thousand years here or there. From a young girl, about 9 years old, they estimate some leg bone fragments, the oldest human remains. And so the narrative starts with there and continues until the establishment of a centralized bureaucratic state, roughly 1530 to 1540, the 1530s. And in the Q&A, I'll be happy, though, to go beyond that and address questions about any era of Ryukyu in history. I mean, I might not know the answer, but certainly if you have questions that are beyond this time frame, feel free to ask. Let me now, what I'm going to do is show you the same thing, but in a different perspective. These are some of the graphics in some of these books that I'm talking about. So here's another way to conceptualize the flow of time in the Ryukyu Islands. The second discontinuity, actually there's two discontinuities there. The second corresponds approximately to the 11th century, and it marks the start of the Gusuku era. It's a time when northern immigrants swept into the Ryukyu Islands, settling them from north to south. And these immigrants displaced the sparse pre-existing population of Jomon people who had been dwelling in the islands. Therefore, the Gusuku era represents a nearly complete changeover of people. And now we also have that verified with DNA as well as many other ways. Notice a few other points. First, 14th century political disruptions around the East China Sea region, including the decline and collapse of the Yuan dynasty in China, the decline and collapse of the Goryeo dynasty in Korea, plus civil war in Japan, all happening in the mid to late 14th century, pushed refugees and others into the Ryukyu Islands. So these are some big disruptions that pushed people in. In 1372, a group of traders in the Urasoe areas near Naha, who were closely connected with Korea, began participating in formal tribute trade with the newly minted Ming dynasty. They operated under the name Sato, and that's the pronunciation in modern Japanese. And whether Sato actually existed as a specific person or was just a name that a group of traders operated under, we can't really tell. He'd always called King Sato the first king of Okinawa, but it might not have even existed as a person. So he's called a king because he conducts formal trade with China. And Sato took the title Wang, meaning someone with a license officially to trade with China. And this Chinese word is always translated as king in English or Japanese. But that can be problematic because the word king has a bunch of additional senses. You imagine somebody sitting in a throne with a crown on his head, giving orders, or maybe even a figurehead. But anyway, the head of state of a bureaucratic country. And Sato or whoever, there was nothing, that was not the case at all in these early days. Since 1372, he was more like a pirate chief. The Ming court extended extremely favorable trade terms to local Okinawan powers as an incentive for them to participate in what the Ming court regarded as lawful trade, as opposed to marauding and smuggling. Thanks to these favorable terms, very quickly, in the island of Okinawa, sprouted 2 more kings and a bunch of royal brothers, cousins, uncles, and other royal relatives. There's so many kings and royalty in this little island of Okinawa. It was once the Ming gravy train opened up, the kings sprouted. And so they were all eager to submit tribute, that is, to do business with the Ming dynasty. And they did, quite vigorously. Thus began what I call the era of trade kings. Eventually, circa 1520 to 1530, one of those trade kings, Shou Xing, managed to become a king in the full sense implied by the English word. So he was the exclusive authoritarian ruler of a bureaucratic state. But that's a development that doesn't happen until about 1520 or 30. So before then, these kings in Okinawa more closely resembled pirate chieftains. Oh, maybe I have to admit someone.
Oh, no, you're fine.
I'm good, okay.
Otherwise-
You'll take care of that, okay. All right, so let's move ahead. Okay, so now, let us get started by introducing a relatively famous object. Here's a replica of it here. Bridge to the Many Countries Bell. It's called Bankoku Shinyo no Kane in Japanese, but there isn't an exact standard English term, so you'll see variations on this word. All right. So, trade king Shou Taikyu commissioned it in 1458. Taikyu appears to have been a devout Buddhist, and he had commissioned many Buddhist temple bells, which were cast by Japanese technicians. This bell, however, hung in Shuri Castle, which was Taikyu's base of operations, and it includes a fairly lengthy inscription. And let me translate the first few lines relatively literally. Ryukyu is a land auspiciously located in the southern sea. It has the excellence of the Korean kingdoms. It is an auxiliary vehicle to the great Ming. It is to Japan like lips are to teeth. And each of these sentences is quite revealing, but see why, how they are revealing requires just a little bit more background. So what did this mean in 1458? Well, the first one is straightforward, but notice the location. If the Ryukyu Islands at this time had been populated by people, say, from Indonesia or the Philippines, then the islands would have been, of course, located in the northern sea. So their stated location in the south indicates a northern orientation. This northern orientation is found throughout classical Ryukyuan culture. For example, the oldest collection of songs, Omoro Soji, in this collection, the word snow appears frequently as a simile. For example, one song praises the rice grown in Sachi as being as white as snow, and several others praise other rice as being as white as snow. There's the snow beach to praise the sand at Yonaha Beach, as well as Yonabaru Beach, and so forth. About 20 references to snow that I counted. And incidentally, just in case you're curious, on January 24th, 2016, between 1:13 and 1:18 p.m., snow was briefly observed falling at 2 different times in the northern Ryukyu island of Amami-Oshima, and the previous snow ever seen there was in 1901. So, and moreover, there are no snow-capped mountains like you have in Hawaii. The only reason snow makes any sense is because these people are coming from Japan and Korea, from northern places. And so notice also now that Korea is first on the list. That's probably not an accident. First on the list of the region's major countries. In early Ryukyuan history, the forthcoming book, I discussed the deep cultural and technological influence of Korea on the early Ryukyu Islands. There's an entire chapter on that. One example is the distinctive Ryukyuan stoneware known as kamuyaki, manufactured from the 11th through the 14th centuries, and it's based on Korean kiln technology, and it's very likely that Korean technicians resided on the island of Tokunoshima, where we now have discovered over 100 Kamuyaki kilns in a huge group. And so from Shotaikyu's perspective, in 1458, Korea was a source of excellent culture and technology. By contrast, the relationship with China's Ming dynasty in the 1450s was functional. The details are complex. This is in Maritime Ryukyu, you can read all about this. But concisely stated, since the 1370s, the deepwater port of Naha functioned as a way for favored Chinese merchants to legally circumvent the Ming maritime prohibitions. Chinese-made ships with Chinese officers and some Okinawan crew and passengers sailed under the auspices of Ryukyuan kings, these trade kings, not only between Naha and China, but also further afield into Southeast Asia. And so, I can talk about this later if you're more interested, but the bottom line is the relationship with China was business. Right? Now, as with China, there was plenty of trade between the Ryukyu Islands and the Japanese islands, but unlike China, there was a close ethnic and cultural relationship between the people of the Ryukyu Islands and Japan, and that's why the bell inscription emphasizes this with the lips and teeth metaphor. So with that in mind, let's now zoom into the present day for just a second. The governor's office here. A copy of the inscription on the bridge to the many countries bell adorns the reception area of the provincial governor's office. All modern commentators, of whom I am aware, interpret the bell and its inscription along the lines of what you see here. That is, as a symbol of Okinawa or the Ryukyu Islands as a whole, as a peaceful little kingdom that got along well with everybody in the region. Often contemporary commentators leverage the alleged peaceful history as a rhetorical advice to add poignancy to critiques of the presence of military bases, for example. So that said, though, in its day, in 1458, the bell was anything but a celebration of peace. It was a celebration of victory in a series of wars. Right? So let me provide a little background on that. One important background point concerns the political geography of the Ryukyu Islands during the 15th century and earlier. The people we call kings were not rulers of significant tracts of land. Instead, they were kings of the port of Naha. There might have been even more than one of them. There were dozens of harbor fortress pairs, not only in Okinawa, but the other Ryukyu Islands. And these locations sometimes cooperated with their neighbors and sometimes fought with them. But before 1458, they were all independent entities. Importantly, major harbor fortress pairs were linked to harbors in the northern Ryukyu Islands. You see it on the left. To harbors further north in Japan and Korea, as well as to harbors in southern China. So this is just three of them to make it, but here there was many more than three. So now with that in mind, let's return to Shotaikyuu in the 1450s. Around 1453, a somewhat mysterious war broke out in and around Shuri Castle. The trade king at the time was Sho Kinpuku, someone about whom we know nothing other than the name. As the official story goes, the war was a succession struggle between Furi, a younger brother of Kinpuku, and Shiro, Kinpuku's son. We know from archaeological evidence that a significant part of Shuri Castle burnt down around this time, and Chinese records indicate a request for a new royal seal on account of the previous one melting in the conflagration. So something was happening. According to the official histories of the Ryukyu kingdom, both Furi and Shiro died of their wounds, but according to legend, Furi survived and went into hiding. Right, so now whatever exactly happened, out of this tumultuous situation emerged Haikyuu, an unrelated warlord from Goeku in central Okinawa. Goeku is right where it gets thin up there. Haikyuu was a pivotal figure. His predecessors had been content to profit from the tribute trade with China, but Haikyuu sought to expand that enterprise. He waged war against the powerful harbor fortress pairs of Nakabusku and Katsuben, conquering both in succession. Both Nakagusuku and Katsuden had extensive connections with harbors in the northern Ryukyu Islands. Japan, in the case of Katsuden, also with Korea. So with the conquest of Katsuden in 1458, Taikyu's portfolio of harbors became, was significantly increased. And at this point, and only at this point, 1458, could Ryukyu, in this case meaning Okinawa, southern Okinawa, reasonably be called a bridge to many countries. Before that, it wasn't. So that's thanks to victories in these series of wars. Now it's a bridge. For the first time, one person controls routes, or at least has some control over or profits from routes that extend up to Korea, Japan, all the way down the Ryukyu Islands and across to China. So Sho Taikyu's bridge to the many countries bell was a monument to his military conquest. And in retrospect, we can see also that that's a step in the direction of a centralized state. Although at the time, you wouldn't necessarily have known that. The larger point here is simply that early Ryukyuan history was substantially more complex and turbulent than is portrayed in most modern monuments, the governor's office, the many Ryukyuan history YouTube videos, survey histories, and even many academic monographs. Indeed, many of the common portrayals, such as Sho Taikyu's bell as an artifact of a peaceful society, are entirely off base, at least in the sense of going back into those days. There are several reasons for this situation, but here I want to examine only two. First is the deep influence of the official histories, and second is the currently dominant framework of Ryukyuan history, which I call the internal development model. Pause here, and let's look at those official histories. Sorry. There we go. Okay, so slide off. Okay, so the term official histories refers to 4 works published between 1650 and 1745. Sometimes people will add a couple of others, but strictly speaking, it's these. 2 of which have the same name, just to make things a little more confusing. All right, so Reflections on Chuzan, or Chuzan Seikon, if you're left, is the first, and it was published in 1650 by a guy named Shoto Ken, is the main author. Reflections was written mainly in Japanese, and in the 1701 edition of Genealogy of Chuzan. And by the way, the word Chuzan here, let's just take that as one of the many names for the royal court at Shuri. It's complicated to get into the details. So Reflections was written in 1650, and then the first edition of Genealogy of Chuzan in 1701 was supposedly a translation of it into classical Chinese. However, the content of the 2 books is substantially different. Maybe it's a lot of overlap, but there's significant differences too. And then the 1725 edition of Genealogy of Chuzan was a major revision of that work. So really, these are 2 different books, even though they have the same title. Its author, Sion, had access to the complete collection of Ming records, and he gave priority to them in revising his narrative. Kyuyo, the title is hard to translate. It roughly alludes to beautiful Ryukyu. Differs stylistically from the other 3 volumes. It's a series of articles of varying length, and it makes extensive use of official legends. So it's quite a different, but very similar overlap. They all have a lot of similarities, but also significant differences. Broadly speaking, they have the common goal of presenting Ryukyuan history in a positive light. Moreover, they all reflect classical Chinese principles of historical causality, in which the moral status of rulers plays out in historical events. The specific narratives, however, are significantly different from one to the next. For example, we've already seen Sho Taikyu, so let's use him as an example. All the volumes tried to fit Sho Taikyu into an alleged dynasty of kings, but they do not agree on such basic facts as when Sho Taikyu was born or who his father was. So, they have trouble with that because he's just some outside guy who comes in and tries to stick him into the line. All right, so the official histories are not reliable guides to Ryukyuan history prior to the 16th century. Instead, these works reflect their own time, as is often the case, right? So they reflect the issues and values of the early modern era, not the circumstances of the Ryukyu Islands before the time of a centralized state. The official histories came into existence in their own day as secondary sources whose narratives about early Ryukyu were cobbled together mainly from legends and also with some Chinese sources thrown in. However, because conventional documentary sources for this era are so few, I'll explain that in a minute. Modern historians have tended to regard the official histories as reliable primary sources. Yeah, they start out as very unreliable secondary sources, even by the people who wrote them at the time, and then now they're the solid bedrock foundation primary sources. And of course, this is a big problem. One of the tasks I set for myself in Maritime Ryukyu was to write a history of the islands without any reliance on the official histories for the material prior to the 16th century. And I made a couple of accidental small errors in that regard. The stuff is so ingrained in our heads, but for the most part, I think it succeeded. Okay. So now the different models. In early Ryukyuan history, the forthcoming book, I survey the major frameworks for the writing of early Ryukyuan history. From the early 20th century into the 1970s, the dominant framework was what I call the ancient branch model. And these terms are all my own for the models. Simply stated, it tended to regard the Ryukyu Islands as an offshoot or branch of mainland Japan. Historians in this model tended to regard the Ryukyu Islands as a small-scale, late-developing version of mainland Japan, with some adjustments to accommodate the different geographic environment. In this model, agriculture was the economic basis of society, and agricultural surpluses drove state formation. The U.S. occupation of Okinawa from 1945 to 72 strengthened this interpretive framework as historians emphasized the common essence between the Ryukyu Islands and the Japanese motherland. The reversion of Japanese sovereignty in 1972 set the stage for a major change. With the Ryukyu Islands now safely ensconced within the Japanese state, it became ideologically possible and emotionally desirable to focus on Ryukyuan distinctiveness. Also, the multidisciplinary scholars who worked in the ancient branch model, in other words, these early generations were highly interdisciplinary and self-taught. They give way in the 1980s to professional historians with the proper degrees from the proper universities. So, the professional historians take over from around 1980. And the result was what I call the internal development model. And while it acknowledged that the human population of the Ryukyu Islands originally came from Japan, the emphasis in this model was Ryukyu's distinctive environment, resulting in a history significantly different from that of mainland Japan. The term Ryukyu Kingdom became almost a mantra, and historians working in this model, like the authors of the official histories, regarded southern Okinawa as the geographic locus of the start of Ryukyuan history. This model was new and exciting in the 1980s when I began working on Ryukyu as a graduate student, and the major internal development model historians greatly influenced my first book. The 1980s, however, was also a decade when archaeology began to flourish. And indeed, almost as soon as the internal development model historians began to craft new narratives, archaeological findings began to undermine that narrative. In 1983, for example, the first of over 100 gray stoneware, that is kamuiyaki, kilns were discovered in the northern Ryukyu island of Tokunoshima. Kamuiyaki was this high quality pottery that I mentioned earlier, made with Korean technology starting in the 11th century. Subsequently, several other important discoveries were made in the northern Ryukyu Islands, most important of which was the excavation of the Gusuku site complex on the small island of Kikaijima starting in 2003. And by 2008, it was clear that, at least among archaeologists, that the history of Japonic Ryukyu began in Kikaijima in the northern Ryukyu Islands, not in Okinawa. In short, archaeology has undermined the standard narrative of early Ryukyu that was developed in the internal development model. And so I would propose we need a new model. And I will also talk more about Kikaijima in just a few minutes. Okay. So the external agents model is roughly what you see here. My proposed external agents model, the drivers of early Ryukyuan history were typically people who came into the islands from outside. Most of them came from the Japanese islands, but the Korean contribution was especially important in the realm of culture and technology. Also in northern Okinawa, there's strong evidence of the presence of Mongols and Alans, those are people from Europe, who fled there as the Yuan dynasty collapsed in the 14th century. The 14th century collapse of the Korean Goryeo dynasty and the wars between the northern and southern courts in Japan also pushed people into the Ryukyu Islands. Sailors based in the southern Ryukyu Islands pursued trade with coastal China and with locations further afield in Southeast Asia from the early 14th century, the 1310s and 20s, or maybe even sooner. We just can't verify quite the sooner part. Another important component of the external agents model is taking the physical environment seriously. So even though the internal development model claims to do that, they really get hung up on the Ryukyu kingdom, and they just kind of, that's about as far as it goes. Soil composition and other factors such as saltwater intrusion made cereal grain agriculture very difficult and relatively unproductive. Although populated by northern agriculturalists from the 11th century onward, the environment of the Ryukyu Islands prevented the development of a full agricultural society. Instead, the location of the islands was ideal for the development of trading and raiding societies. Agriculture became an important supplement to the local food supply, but it did not become the basis of state formation. So on this point, my model differs from both the ancient branch and the internal development model. Historians working in the internal development model, the one that gets started around 1980, tended to regard the Ryukyu Islands as having been isolated. However, from Neolithic times to the 17th century, the Ryukyu Islands were not isolated. They were an integral part of the East China Sea and its flows of people, culture, and goods. Only in the 1620s did the islands become mostly isolated, both from Japan and from other locations. One result of this isolation was an acceleration of the development of distinctive Ryukyuan cultures, along with ethnogenesis, but happening in different places and at different times among different segments of society. So by the 19th century, the idea of Ryukyuans as a distinctive cultural and ethnic group had come into existence. It's a very complicated story with ethnogenesis. Probably requires an entire separate book. It's in my head big. Yeah, it's one of those five. It's not great. Even though many historians and others continue to imagine that a singular group of people that we could call Ryukyuans has persisted in the islands since the Stone Age, it's still the dominant image. Archaeology, bolstered by increasingly sophisticated DNA analysis, indicates that the Ryukyu Islands were not a closed system, and that there were several major discontinuities with respect to the population of the islands. Just mention sources here for, I've already touched on these points. Before discussing some of these points in a little more detail, it's probably a good idea to just think about sources. We have trade documents compiled by Chinese merchant officials based in Naha from the 1370s onward, as well as official Chinese and Korean records, which are connected almost entirely with trade and trade-related diplomacy. There's a few monuments bearing inscriptions which began to appear in the late 1490s. However, we have no extant domestic governance documents until the 1530s. We'll not find a single domestic, like a list, a record, a tax, something, till the 1530s. And even those are very sparse until well into the 17th century. The 1530s is also when the first volume of the Omoro Soshi, the classic songs, came into existence after Buddhist priests from Japan wrote down the songs. So in other words, prior to the 16th century, physical evidence, not written documents, are the primary means for reconstructing early Ryukyuan history. Certainly, we do use every scrap of written document out there, but there's not many of them. All right, and so that's why we need to really focus on archaeology to get at this early period. So the Gusku site complex. Here's the northern Ryukyu Islands on your left. I call them the northern tier islands in my books. And then here's where the Gusku site complex is on that little island of Kikaijima. So it's called in Japanese Gusku Iseki-gun, or Gusuku Site Complex is a collection of 8 archaeological sites atop a plateau on the island of Kikaijima. The complex constitutes the largest archaeological site in the Ryukyu Islands in terms of area. It was in operation from the 10th to the 14th centuries, with the 11th and 12th being the time of peak prosperity. The Gusuku Site Complex was a multi-ethnic international trading and manufacturing center. In residence were merchants from mainland Japan and Korea, and possibly from other locations. So we know Japan, Korea, and maybe somewhere else. The site relied on raw materials from nearby Amami Oshima, and it supervised the production of kamuyaki pottery at Tokunoshima. When waves of Japonic migrants flowed into the Ryukyu Islands starting in the 11th century, they did so in a north to south pattern, with Kikaijima as the main source of supplies and probably people as the staging area. Recent research in historical linguistics published in Evolutionary Human Sciences by Alexandra Yaros and her colleagues indicates that Kikaijima was the likely geographic source from which Proto-Ryukyuan dispersed southward. So this is where it starts. Japonic Ryukyu. Obviously, in a sense, Ryukyuan history starts 35,000 years ago with the lake bones. But all right, so the ancient branch model of Ryukyuan history and the internal development model both share an important assumption. Historians in both models have assumed that because agriculture appeared in the Ryukyu Islands during the 11th century, that agricultural societies developed soon thereafter. Moreover, agricultural surpluses drove the process of state formation. In part, this conception is based on perceptions of the power of agriculture. We see this throughout world history. In many, but by no means all cases, indeed, when agriculture is introduced, it does lead to agricultural societies. This has happened all around the world, but it does not have to happen. And there are many instances which, in the book, I go a lot of examples where it didn't happen. In the past decade, several historians of the Ryukyu Islands have rejected the idea that the islands were home to agricultural societies during the Gusuku era, or perhaps ever. And I agree with their assessment and devote a chapter in early Ryukyuan history to this matter. The evidence that the Gusuku era Ryukyu Islands were not agricultural societies comes from soil science, archaeology, the history of malaria in the region, weather patterns, and early modern and modern documents revealing very low agricultural productivity. So if in 1800 the productivity is extremely low, it's probably not going to be higher in 1150. Through bringing all these sources together, the same type of conclusion comes up over and over again. This place has agriculture, but does not appear to be a productive agricultural society. During the 14th and 15th centuries, the Ryukyu Islands were the site, again, I hate to say it over and over, but of trading and raiding societies for which small-scale agriculture, almost like gardening, supplemented the food supply. It was wealth generated from trade that powered increasing social complexity that ultimately led to state formation. So one argument in maritime Silk Roads, that's the general history, is that despite sometimes Herculean attempts to forge a viable agricultural society during the 17th and 18th centuries, the project was ultimately a failure. The collapse of the Ryukyu kingdom during the 19th century was as much the result of failed agriculture as anything else. And there's multiple factors, but failed agriculture is perhaps the most important. Moreover, the increasingly severe tax burden imposed by the state during this time completely eroded any popular support for the monarchy. Despite its cheerful and colorful portrayal in contemporary Okinawan tourism, the early modern Ryukyu kingdom was an oppressive institution vis-a-vis most of the residents of the Ryukyu Islands. When it formally came to an end during the 1870s, nobody other than royal officials and aristocrats endeavored to preserve it. That's a point that bears, a little bit of emphasis, because it's the wonderful Ryukyu kingdom. Most people hated it. They were really happy to see it gone. Now the Meiji state wasn't much better, but anyway, that's another story. We can talk about that. Okay, so let's see, slide 19. Yeah, we're on time on 6. Sorry. So returning to approximately the 12th and early 13th centuries, here is a hub and spoke model that I have proposed for the regional interactions. notice that the focus is on the Ryukyu Islands here. If, for example, the focus had been on these large Chinese ports, then they would become hubs. So, I don't want to, but in this focus here, they become spokes. So as you can see, there were two major hubs, Hakata in northwest Kyushu, that'd be Fukuoka, and the northern Ryukyu Islands of Taiwan on the Ojima and Ojima. At this time, Chinese goods, mostly pottery, flowed into the Ryukyu Islands indirectly. Chinese merchants established a large settlement at Hakata. And Korean goods also flowed directly into Hakata, which is right across from Korea. From Hakata, Chinese, Korean, and Japanese manufactured goods went down into the northern Ryukyu Islands, and to pay for these goods, valuable island products, I'm only going to name three of many, such as turban shells, which were the mother of pearl material, bishop wood or akangi, so it's a reddish type of wood, and sea turtle shells. Those things shipped up to Hakata to pay for the imports. And from there, those items, some of them made their way to Korea and to China as well. So there may have been also a direct link between Southern Korea and the Northern Ryukyu Islands. There's so much tantalizing indirect evidence, but we just can't quite be certain at this time. Hopefully someday we will be able to. In any case, Korean culture, goods, technology, and people came into the Ryukyu Islands via the traditional route or the usual route, Busan or anywhere in Southern Korea, Tsushima, Hakata, Western Kyushu, and then down the Ryukyu Islands. The northern Ryukyu Islands up to Kyushu was called Michinoshima for several centuries. Literally, a road of islands, because you could just island hop from one to the next with very simple boats. Now, to get from Okinawa to the southern Ryukyu Islands was more difficult. During the 20th century, during the 12th century, Okinawa was a relative backwater compared with the northern Ryukyu Islands. One reason for this conclusion, just some evidence, is a gradient of high-end pottery. So, for example, in the 12th century, we find the most numerous Chinese pottery and Korean pottery in the northern Ryukyu Islands, numerous but significantly less so in Okinawa, and there's just a few little sherds down in the southern Ryukyu Islands. So the pottery gradient is one of many pieces of evidence. Now, in the next century, because of its many geographic advantages, including a deep water port, the only deep water port that could handle large Chinese ships, Okinawa gradually gained relative prominence vis-a-vis the other Ryukyu Islands from the late 13th century onward. So Okinawa will indeed become the center of things, but it takes a while for that to happen. Now, zooming ahead to around 1350, the hubs and spokes of the region look significantly different. Hakata remained a major hub, but the northern Ryukyu Islands no longer played a role in regional commerce. Indeed, for much of the century, these islands were the possession of the Chikama family of Satsuma. Okinawa had become a major hub, and powerful harbor fortress units traded directly with entities in southern China, as well as with entities in Japan and Korea. The southern Ryukyu Islands, and look at my time, I realize it's taking longer than I thought. I'm just gonna see if I can explain it. All right, so you've got the hubs, we've got Okinawa and the southern Ryukyu Islands is a major hub. Southern Ryukyu Islands are trading directly with China now, also with South Asia. All these places are independent of each other. So they're just people doing their thing over here, there's people doing their thing, there's trade this way. And in the meantime, you've got all this warfare going on in the region. It's just spewing off refugees and adventurers. And of course, wako are all over the place. The classic period of wako is like 1350s, right? The peak. And they're especially active in attacking Korea, but they're also attacking the coast of China. They're not just raiding. They're doing that for sure. They're smuggling, yes, but they're also trading and providing security service. And if I'm a merchant and I want to make sure my cargo gets through, I'll hire some wako to protect me against the other wako. So it's a very complex situation. And in Maritime Ryukyu, I talk about it in great detail. I'm just going to really quickly go through to say that in the new book, especially, I'm going to propose a new model of these three principalities. So here's the traditional view: three little territorial states. We have no evidence whatsoever that they existed. And so scholars just make up the boundaries. Once some guy drew lines, yeah, right here, the thin part, hey, we're here, the port of Nama, and they've just been drawing them ever since. We don't have any There's not a shred of document, there's not a, the Omoro Soshi does not mention these three principalities ever, not even once, and it's full of place names. All right, so anyway, in the forthcoming book, I've got a total reconception of this era, and we need to think in terms of groups and like banners and trade names and things like that. So we can talk about that. I reconceptualized the first Shou dynasty, and it comes out much more complicated. That's the point. It was so much more complicated. Again, I have to move on our time. Notice the tendency to use the term Ryukyu kingdom all over the place, this, that, and the other, in both Anglophone and Japanese literature. It was a kingdom, but there's so many caveats. And especially the caveat is it becomes an empire at the same time it becomes a kingdom. So, and how does it do this? By conquering all the other islands. And we have all this. That's the next book after the general history is going to be called Ryukyu's Wars. It'll be all about this in great detail. But and so if you go to Amami Oshima today and you start talking about Ryukyu Kingdom, people thank you. That's once I blurted that term out when I was talking to a guy, and he used the owner of a used bookstore, and he really could see it. And I said, somebody Shuri Teikoku, in other words, the Shuri Empire, and then he smiled. So this is from a tourist guidebook published a few years ago from Amami Oshima. It's like the first few pages are the history, conceptual history of when the Okinawans were oppressing us. Here's the hero of Ishigaki Island, who in 1500 led the island's people against the invaders from Okinawa, and he's a national hero, or Ishigaki hero to this day. The local government puts on a festival for him every year. So it's a kingdom, but it's also an empire. And this is something I wrote about in Maritime Ryukyu, which many people found shocking anyway. But I was very happy to see in 2021 that the National Museum of Japanese History put out an exhibition called Maritime Empire Ryukyu, the Middle Ages from the perspective of Yayama Miyako Namam. Yes, I did pass a copy of my book to someone who was on the board who can read English. Might have had some influence. So I think that's about it. Yes, thank you for your attention. I'm sorry to rush over some of this stuff, but if you have any questions.
Paul Group, I'll let you just deal questions, but there may be some online as well, right?
I am your ass.
And then anytime.
Okay,
You want to introduce yourself?
yeah, I'm Hillary Holbrow. I'm a sociologist of Japan. This is really great. I think it's so rare to attend a talk where every slide my mind is just being blown.
I know.
So fantastic. And I have so many questions. So one question is about, you talked a lot about traders and raiders, but I would like to hear more about the raiders part of this. I understand with trade, there's documentation, right? These are merchants who keep records that then are, passed
Probably
down.
most of them don't.
Most of them don't, but there's some, but raiders don't leave records at all, right?
Right.
So what kind of evidence are you able to use to learn about the history of raiding?
So first of all, although they don't keep records themselves, the folks in China and Korea keep extensive records. This is a huge problem for the Goryeo dynasty in Korea, is that the Wako raids almost, brought the dynasty. Some people say it did bring the dynasty down. So we got from their end, and we can actually just about graph it in the sense of, more, if you can count the number of locations that were attacked per year, the approximate amount of goods that were taken. Of course, a lot of this is guesswork, but so some scholars have even just made graphs saying, here's peak Wako activity, raiding activity in this or that area. The Wako, just to give you an idea of their capacities, they had horse pastures, and on Okinawa, on Jeju, and some other islands. They would actually raise cavalry horses, put them on ships, and they could invade deep into Korea, raid deep into Korea with their cavalry horses, and then sell those same cavalry horses to the Korean government or the Ming. They were always shipping, they could ship, you needed 200 cavalry horses, go to Okinawa, there's a guy there, his name is Kuraru Magohachi, and he will take care of you. Yeah, so, okay, so so how do we know that these wako were in the Ryukyu Islands? Okay, I go into great detail on this in Maritime Ryukyu. A lot of this is documentary based. Okay, there's some archaeology where there are certain items that they trafficked in a lot, and so you would expect, to find those items. And the fact that you find the items doesn't necessarily mean that it was wako, but if it was wako, you'd expect to find these items. So that all checks out. And then when you look closely at Ming Dynasty policy, it becomes pretty clear what they're up to. The standard story, which is so bizarre, is the Ming Dynasty looked over at the Ryukyu Islands and said, "You guys are so cute and you're so nice and peaceful. We're going to give you really good trade terms." Like, the Ming Dynasty doesn't do that. They behead people. So they attempted to suppress the wako by force. They couldn't do it. Next thing they did was to try to find someone in Kyushu who would call himself King of Japan, and then gets trade deal with the Ming, but then it also will promise to suppress the wako. So they found Prince Kanayoshi, who said, "Yeah, well, he's already a prince and king of Japan, sure, but I'll suppress the wako." And after a couple of rounds of trade, the Ming guy's like, "This guy isn't doing anything about the wako." So Plan B was to encourage the wako to settle into the Ryukyu Islands, which they already were, and then to co-opt them, tame them essentially through the tribute system by giving you can send tribute anytime you want, and they would send as many as 5 a year. These incredible amount of stuff. But then we start tightening up, and these folks caused all kinds of trouble in China. Imagine if you're bringing a bunch of pirates over, arson, murder, all sorts of trade problems, making illegal clothing and then selling it in Japan, like Ming, with the dragons on it and all that. And so it's a long story, but there's just all these little different pieces of the puzzle that kind of come together into this conclusion. Another way to think of it too is that given what we know of this whole area, if wako had not been present in the Ryukyu Islands at this era, that would have been something we need to explain. It's like, why they're everywhere else. Yeah.
Thanks very much. This was a fantastic talk and really well timed for us. So this, I have a lot of sympathy with your various.
Nick, introduce yourself.
I'm sorry.
Introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry. I'm Nick. I do really China.
All right, great.
I mentioned you.
Yeah. I have a lot of sympathy with your various parts of your approach. I'm glad to see somebody putting on the term Wang, right? I mean, from the Han Dynasty onward, we still have this broad tendency of the Chinese Empire to just use domestic terms to plug in other populations that the lifestyles of which they don't understand, right?
Yeah.
Extremely speaking. And it was really valuable for us. We were just we have this kind of reading group on comparative empire, right? That we just came down from. But we're talking about these questions of comparability, right? And in some ways, the case that you're looking at in terms of its, despite the fact that it's really, really far in the future, as far as most of the stuff that we talk about, in terms of scale of development of certain aspects of society is very, very comparable. So it was great. I do. I also have a billion questions. I'll try to start with just like a couple. Can we look at the bell inscription again?
Yeah.
Nick does a lot on inscriptions.
Okay. Yeah.
Trust me to go to the bronze first.
Yeah.
Right.
You had at the bell.
Let's work for you here.
So this is just a really small question, but so this is 1458, this thing,
Yes.
right? Which means that by that point in time, the idea of a unified Korea is a very long-lived one, right?
Yeah.
Like under many different months. So I was wondering if there's an ideological significance to the fact that it uses somehow
Right.
to describe it.
There have been much speculation about that. One possibility is that, that somehow these 3 principalities idea is somehow connected to, it's almost like that, people are thinking, Korea had 3 kingdoms, well, actually 4, but whatever. And then it, becomes 1. So, but anyway, scholars have, of course, noted that, and we're wondering, what exactly the significance is. So you get a bunch of different hypotheses, but no one has come up with anything that seems obvious.
Because somebody, by the way, kind of charted out the phonetics of it. Looks like there's a first segment down later in the inscription.
All right.
I'd be interested to know like how that relates to, are the kind of phonetics of that derived from what's going on in the song collection?
Yeah, well,
or are they?
I suspect that in this case, there's a Japanese Buddhist priest who's made the inscription. I'm not sure how well he's attuned to the,
Can we? It's a very similar thing. You showed the published versions of the dramatic histories.
Yeah, I mean, jump down with that. There we go.
And we're talking about this term Shuzan.
Yes.
So it sticks out to me immediately, right? Because in early China,
Yeah.
right, there's this small state, Zhongshan,
Yeah.
that exists into the Warring States period, right? But is not like at all a player in broad regional politics, but is especially well known because of its unusual archaeological situation. So like, is there any sign that that was something that people were aware of in the islands at this point in
I
time?
don't think so. Okay, well, okay, so these names, the name Chuzan comes from Chinese records. One of the things about these so-called 3 principalities that I didn't quite emphasize enough, I just started rushing, but is that they are Chinese creations. They're found only in Chinese documents. Omoro Sochi does not mention them. Well, I did say that even once. And so it would actually be great if we could ask these Chinese merchant officials who are stationed at the port of Naha, why did you call, this one Chuzan? And it probably because they were thinking Naha is in the middle. And we're gonna have 3 mountains. And so, north, middle, and south. When the Ming Dynasty made contact with the Sultanate of Sulu, which is oriented in an east-west direction, Sulu said, "Yeah, we got a king," and they actually shipped a pot of soil from Sulu to the and they get all this great stuff back. And then as soon as that happens, we've got 2 more kings. We have an east, a central, and a west. And so I think it's probably not, there's not any great significance. It's just that we're kind of chopping up the territory and calling him the king of this and the king of that.
Yeah, they could well be. There's also in names of that format in particular with the character Zhong, right? There's the kind of like auxiliary locative function when you post those that I'm probably using these terms wrong.
That's all right.
But suffice to say that like Zhongshan can mean in the middle of the mountains as well as happening.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm sorry, that's very.
So I'm Russell Burge, I'm an historian of modern Korea, and I wanted to both kind of speak back to Nick's question about the Samhan, if we go back to that slide. I'm a 20th century historian, so these are things I say with great caveats.
Okay.
I have more questions than answers, but I know that there's in the Korea field studies of the Samhan idiom. I think it's from Breaker, has this article that you probably read, the 3 and 1, the 1 and 3.
Oh no,
But about how the Samhan I think it begins in Lake Koryo as this idea of a trans-dynastic Korea.
Okay.
So there's these explorations of like pre-modern Korean nationalism. Samhan is one of these possible idioms that link to dynasties. But I was actually going to ask about this because I had no idea. And I'm a 20th century person, so I wouldn't know, but I had no idea that this term was used outside Korea. And I was really curious, is this like how Korea is often referred to in this time period, like in Japan or?
Well, okay, so it's important to keep in mind that at this time, there are actual Korean people in the Ryukyu Islands. This is, so it's not, so we always tend to think, to take the Ryukyu Islands and make it into a one thing and then say, how did it look at Korea? But it's Koreans there because they're part of the wako. That's the thing I didn't have a chance to mention. These wako were, some estimates by Japanese scholars are that they were at this era, the mid 14th century, that there were as many as half of them were Korean, or these mixtures of Korean and Japanese people. So they're in the Ryukyu Islands, and also they're bringing human trafficking. The port of Naha was a major human trafficking center at the time. There's constant groups of Koreans working in as slaves or whatever you're gonna call them in debt, for a period of several years. And then they get shipped back to Korea, and there are brokers who come into the Ryukyu Islands and bring them to Korea. That's a whole different area that I didn't have a chance to talk about, but from all these reasons, there's Koreans actually there, so I wouldn't, even though a Japanese priest made this, I wouldn't be surprised if this, the 3 Han is actually, because of a Korean presence there.
That makes total sense. Could I also ask, and then I'll stop, but I was just really curious. Jeju Island pops up a lot of your maps,
Yes,
but Jeju, by the early Joseon period, yeah, we can say it's politically under Korean domination, but it has this tenuous relationship to the center,
Yes.
right? So I was curious how Jeju fits into your analysis of the dynamic.
yeah. So I just call it the Korean island of Jeju, is it because to tell people, the modern situation. But yeah, it's a fascinating place, like so many of these islands. It's horse pastures for cavalry horses. It is a place where logging, these kind of hybrid Japanese Korean people go to trade. At one point, we've got pretty good evidence from Korean records when Goryeo is trying to bring it into the fold. That the bottom line is that wako and local residents, many of whom are Mongols, originally, they combine forces and fight off the Goryeo forces for, I forgot the exact number of years, but a dozen years or so. And so it's very much in sort of in that wako mix of the things.
It's really interesting.
Well, like everybody else, I have about 10 different questions. It was, extremely mind-blowing and but also confusing. I mean, there's a lot in there,
Yeah.
right? So thinking about how I teach undergraduate classes, how to condense all this down, but leaving that aside, I'll let that bubble around. But it strikes me that the politics of this cuts in so many different directions. Man, I don't imagine this is a popular talk to give in Okinawa.
I know that same question.
So I'm curious about that, but also this the very last point you made about the National Museum.
Yeah.
Talking about Okinawa as an empire. Yes, that probably is historically satisfying from your perspective in terms of trying to reflect a kind of reality. But there's also politics of that, I would imagine, from the Japanese center, right? We weren't the only empire, and they were warlike before the bases were there.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of different.
Yeah, certainly someone can make that case.
Yeah.
For sure.
So it's a convenient kind of argument. It's the kind of
Mhm.
revisionist argument that serves other political
Yeah, right.
purposes.
I mean, that's the thing with any argument can
Sure.
be made to serve any,
But I'm just wondering how you think about the
Yeah.
politics.
All right,
of
so
pushing against.
I mean, I'm kind of in this privileged position in the sense that being at Penn State, I can work on these topics. Nobody has any idea what I'm working on. My other colleagues, I was telling.
That typical
Like someone came in my office and goes, "Oh, what's all this Oriental writing?" And
That's a probably.
they don't think what I'm doing is important, but I don't care. So the obscurity really is beneficial, whereas a lot of these Japanese scholars whose work I've benefited from greatly, they suffer. And some like Yoshinari Naoki had a book that came out in 2020, and the entire second half of the book was an angry diatribe against someone who I know very well and who helped my career back in the 1980s. And I agree with the scholarship, the critiques, but it's so, and Yoshinari, feels like he's been pushed out of his post and he had to retire early, and that's true. So if I were in Japan, and he's in Tokyo, so if I were even just in Japan, it would be intense. In fact, I went to the Hosei Daigaku's Institute for Okinawan Studies, and just mentioned a few names and a few things, and it was like a chill just fell over the place. You could feel the ice. Yeah, this is highly fraught because there's been so much invested in this image of this peaceful, wonderful kingdom. It's such a nice image. I like it too, but so I'm when I was just getting going on Maritime Ryukyu, I started realizing this is really rad. And I thought, so wait a minute, I'm 50 something years old, if you're never gonna say something bold, you know, I mean, if not, you know, now's the time to do it. Your first book, I get that has to be, and I wasn't trying to when I wrote my first book, but it just happens to be what everyone wanted to hear, and they still sell, you know, the bestseller of all my books, and so yeah, there's a fraught politics, and I'm just in, you know, to me now it's just almost like curious. It's this puzzle that I want to work on.
You're good at that.
Yeah, and I love it. It engages me, and I don't really feel like, say, going to Okinawa and talking about this or whatever. But you know, the books are out there. They'll, you know,
So Ryukyu
let me-
Daigaku is not going to invite you to give.
they're not
Yeah.
exactly. They're not exactly.
Let me ask two, I know we're probably getting close on time, but two historical questions. Mine also, one of them also relates to the official histories.
Yes.
The
Okay.
first one was 1650.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just curious about, of course, you gestured to the Chinese dynastic history kind of template and the tropes and conventions of that kind of history writing. But that's also a period of time in Japan where there's a kind of consolidation ideologically of the Tokugawa regime in terms of what it meant, its connections to the past, biographies of its originator. Is there any influence into your way of thinking from the Japanese Tokugawa perspective in history writing? In terms of why these were put together then? That's my question.
Yeah. Not even so much in the broad sense. I think broadly speaking, so in 1650 with Chuzan Seikon, this is the first generation of Ryukyuans who have a pretty good grounding in classical Chinese and Japanese literature and so forth. They're the first well-educated generation. So that one is actually quite awkwardly written in so many ways. I think because it's the first shot. He's trying to do it, and he really struggles to deal with things. Where then when you see Sion's really polished book from 1725, it's brilliant rhetorically in a lot of ways that, you know, it's kind of avoids issues where we don't really know, but we're going to imply this and that. So there's a smoothing process that goes on. You can see in Sion's version things that clearly seem to be like the Sankin Kotai system and so forth, not specifically mentioned, but for example, he'll say King Shoshin. This is that guy who is really long reign, and so from about 1470 to 1520 approximately. So it says in here, King Shoshin caused all of the aji. This is a term for local chieftains, like these harbor fortresses, lords of those harbor fortresses. He forced them all to relocate their residences to the capital of Shuri and to put their weapons in a storehouse. And you can see it's just exactly, you know,
Sounds like
the
exchange system.
right. And we have no evidence that happened. But it's just it's as if it's this tendency to think, you know, well, we'll take what happens in Japan and just assume that that's happening here. You even see it in these.
So, and then the period from 1100s roughly to the 1458 turning point. When you talked about what Wang means, this title, and obviously there's a continental origination and meaning there. But the Kamakura and Ashikaga shogunates, was there anything diplomatic officially going on? What did that look like?
That looked like all right. So the not the Kamakura, but the Ashikaga. There were it was a kind of, it's very interesting. So we have a set of about 10 notes that were written from the Ryukyuan king to the Kamakura shogun and vice versa. You know, like I forgot how many we have in each direction.
Yeah.
And they're very casual. They're written in Japanese. It's almost like, you know, Uncle Joe, you know, hey, I hope you like the wine, you know, whatever. And yeah, it's just this very, and so
no title was being.
Yono Nishi. So there's here, Wang is Chinese, right? And it was never ever used within the Ryukyu Islands, you know, among themselves or vis-a-vis Japan. It's a Chinese thing. So the word that would be used in semi-formal or formal documents coming, say, from the shogunate would be Yono Nushi. So Ryukyu Yono Nushi was the title of, so ruler of the world, or you know, it's this yo, this is the yo. Yono Nushi, yeah. So, So, yeah, that would be the term of the Ryukyu and monarchs or any like kind of powerful person.
I mean, that didn't get used with the Ainu, well, that's not a term that was used in any other,
What's that?
that didn't get used with the Ainu or anything like that, right? So
No,
only-
no, yeah, or I don't know that much about the Ainu case, but I'm sure there may have been some different set of terms.
There might be some questions from online.
So Morton has his hand raised.
Sorry,
Morton,
Morton.
do you have a question?
Yeah, no worries. No, I just wanted to make sure that to protect people from themselves because I know they could sit there and talk about this all day. The time is up.
Well, I know we're getting close to
And,
my
I just wanted to say that well, as everyone else, I have a gazillion questions as well, and I hope I get a chance to meet up with you, Greg, in Boston soon, and ask you some of them. But as a proud citizen of the Kingdom of Denmark, the island nation, I am also very sympathetic to the whole historiographical construct of greatness turning into, because we haven't won a war in 1,000 years, turning into like a peace-loving nation. Right?
Those Vikings really were.
Exactly right. But if people are sitting and feeling, hey, I would love to hear more about pirates, I just want to note that on March 3rd, we'll get Peter Szapinski to come to campus and talk about piracy in 16th century. So we'll get more of the wako and hear more about this, and I'm very excited about that too. And this was fantastic, Greg. So much. I'm so grateful for you to making the long drive here, and I want to yes, thank you, and thank everyone for coming today. Sorry for cutting it short. But maybe the conversations can continue in a more informal forum. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Morton.
Thank you for inviting me over. We'll continue.
Thank you.